Okay, so get ready, because we are diving right into the book of Revelation.
Yeah, we're going deep on this one.
I know. It can seem pretty um, dense, to say the least.
Definitely complex.
Yeah, but that's exactly why we're here.
Right. To unpack it all, and especially to see it through the lens of the Joseph Smith translation.
Right.
It's got these incredible images, powerful warnings, and ultimately it's super hopeful.
The book of Revelation, in general, it's this apocalyptic type of writing. So we're talking almost 2,000 years ago, and they're using these vivid symbols to depict the end times, this ultimate battle of good versus evil, and then, of course, God's victory in the end. Now, it's a book that sparked a ton of different interpretations, but today we're zeroing in on the Joseph Smith translation.
Right. So when I got to those opening chapters, those letters to the 7 churches, it felt like reading these intense personal letters, almost like a spiritual report card for each one.
And what's interesting there is that those were actual churches in Asia Minor, but they also work on this symbolic level. They represent all these different spiritual states that people find themselves in, like across time.
So not just ancient history.
Right.
These letters have insights for us today, like that line to the Ephesians about abandoning their first love. That's not about romance, right? It feels like a much deeper warning about losing that initial passion for your faith.
Absolutely. It's that question of, are we just going through the motions, or are we really connected to the source of our faith? And, the encouraging thing is John doesn't just point out the flaws. He also commends those churches that are getting it right.
Okay.
Like the Philadelphians, he praises their perseverance, even though they have a little strength.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but some days I feel like I'm running on fumes, spiritually speaking.
Right. We all have those moments. It's a good reminder that outward appearances can be deceiving, and true strength, it comes from within.
Yeah.
Okay, but speaking of intense, we got to talk about those visions John has of heaven. Thrones, beasts covered in eyes, 24 elders. It's a lot to unpack.
It is. And, it's easy to get lost in those fantastical images, but the key is to understand what they symbolize.
Okay.
So in chapters 4 and 5, John's describing this throne in heaven. It's surrounded by a rainbow, which, if you think back to the story of Noah, represents God's majesty, but also his promise of faithfulness. And then you've got these 4 living creatures. They're often depicted as a lion, ox, man, and eagle, each one representing a different aspect of Christ's nature and ministry.
Okay, so we're not taking this literally, but understanding what each element represents. So the lion might be Christ's strength, the ox is sacrifice, and so on.
Exactly. And by understanding those symbols, we gain these deeper insights into who Christ is and what his mission is all about. Take those 24 elders, for instance. They're often seen as representing the redeemed from both the Old and New Testaments gathered around God's throne in worship. It's this beautiful picture of unity and the culmination of God's plan.
And we can't forget that sealed book, right? The one only the Christ is worthy to open. What's the significance of that?
Yes. That sealed book represents God's plan for the end times, a plan that only Christ is worthy and able to fully reveal and execute. It's a reminder that even though we might not understand everything that's happening in the world, God has a plan, and it's ultimately a plan of redemption and restoration. But, as you're about to find out, it's not all smooth sailing from here.
You're telling me we're moving from those heavenly visions into some pretty intense scenes of judgment, right? Seals, trumpets, bowls. Feels like we're about to witness some serious cosmic drama.
You could say that. This is where Revelation really earns its reputation, vivid and, let's be honest, sometimes kind of terrifying imagery. Remember how you wanted to understand the core message of this book? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. John isn't just giving us this highlight reel of the future. He's using those symbols, those seals, trumpets, bowls, to show how God intervenes in history, how he's urging people towards repentance, and ultimately how his justice unfolds.
Okay, so I've always wondered about these judgments. Is it God is punishing the world out of anger?
That's a common misunderstanding. It's important to look at the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
Yes, there's an element of consequence for choices made, for sure. But that ultimate aim of these judgments, it's purification, even restoration. Think of it like a refiner's fire.
Okay.
It's intense, but it burns away the impurities to reveal something stronger, more beautiful underneath.
Okay, that makes sense. But man, some of those images are pretty hard-hitting. I'm picturing those 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: conquest, war, famine, death. It's eerie how relevant that feels to what's happening in the world today.
It's definitely meant to grab our attention, right?
Yeah.
Make us think about the consequences of, straying from that path that God's laid out for us.
Yeah.
And you're right, those symbols, they resonate really deeply with us, even thousands of years later. Take that star wormwood, for example, poisoning the waters. It's this stark reminder of the potential for destruction on a massive scale. But maybe it's also like a cautionary tale about how we're treating the planet, how interconnected everything really is.
So it's not just about predicting a specific future, but more like prompting us to examine our actions right now. You know, as we're talking about these judgments, I can't help but think about the fall of Babylon, which you mentioned earlier.
Right.
It's such a powerful image, the city consumed by its own wealth and wickedness.
Ah, Babylon. That symbol, it's echoed throughout history, haven't it?
Yeah.
John paints this incredibly vivid picture of this decadent city, drunk on luxury, on power, representing everything that opposes God. And ultimately, it faces divine judgment. But here's the thing, Babylon. It isn't just some physical location. It's a symbol of a state of heart, a spiritual condition.
So when John's describing Babylon's downfall, that call for God's people to come out of her, my people, it's this exodus from this toxic environment, this call to separate ourselves from anything that pulls us away from God.
You got it. It's about discernment, recognizing those influences, whether they're internal or external, that can lead us astray. And remember, Babylon's fall, it isn't just some past event. It's this metaphor for what happens when we choose darkness over light, selfishness over love.
Okay, so, wow, we've journeyed through some pretty intense territory here. Judgments, plagues, the fall of Babylon. It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
So before we move on, let's just pause for a second. What's the core message John wants us to take away from all of this?
It's a call to action, really. A reminder that we're not just passive bystanders in this whole cosmic drama.
Right.
We have a choice to make. Are we going to align ourselves with God's vision of justice, righteousness, love? Or are we going to get caught up in the allure of Babylon, those temporary pleasures and pursuits that ultimately leave us empty?
It's interesting because even amidst these warnings and judgments, there's this this undercurrent of hope running through it all. Even when things look their bleakest, John never loses sight of God's ultimate plan.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Revelation so powerful, right? It doesn't just diagnose the problem, it offers a solution. It points us towards a future where God's reign is fully realized, where that darkness is banished, and love triumphs.
And that's where we get to that stunning vision of the new heaven and a new earth, right?
Exactly.
The ultimate reset button.
It's like God takes all the brokenness of this world, and he creates something totally new, infinitely more beautiful in its place. And John, in his typical fashion, doesn't just tell us about it. He paints this breathtaking picture with words.
Okay, so we're moving from doom and gloom to ultimate hope and restoration. Talk about a plot twist. But before we dive into all the details of this new creation, I gotta ask, you mentioned earlier that the number 666 pops up in Revelation, and it's always sparked these endless debates and speculation. What's your take on it?
It's definitely one of the most intriguing and, controversial symbols in Revelation, isn't it?
Right.
And you're right. There's no shortage of interpretations out there. But I think instead of getting caught up in trying to pinpoint one specific person or entity, it's more helpful to see that number as representing these corrupting influences, the kind that can infiltrate any heart, any society. It's that spirit of Antichrist, that opposition to God's truth and love that John's really warning us against.
That makes sense. So it's less about decoding some secret code and more about recognizing those patterns of corruption and deceit in the world and even within ourselves.
Exactly. And that's what makes Revelation so relevant today. It's not just about predicting one specific future. It's about equipping us to discern those forces that are at work in the world and make choices that line up with God's heart.
And those choices, ultimately, they lead us towards that incredible vision of the new heaven and new earth.
Yes.
So let's dive into those final chapters where John gives us this glimpse of what's possible when God's plan comes to fruition. It's like the ultimate happily ever after, right?
You could say that. It's the culmination of all history, the fulfillment of God's promises. It's a vision of perfect peace, harmony, and everlasting joy. And it all starts with God's dwelling place coming down from heaven to earth, the New Jerusalem.
The New Jerusalem. Talk about a city that needs no Instagram filter.
Right.
John really went all out describing this place. Walls of jasper, streets paved with gold.
Right.
It's enough to make even the most skeptical architect do a double take.
It is pretty amazing. And as dazzling as those details are, it's important to remember that John's not giving us a blueprint, right? He's using this really symbolic language to get at the beauty, the splendor, the utter perfection of this new creation. It's a place where God's presence is so real, so immediate. God's presence, it just permeates everything. It's like the veil is lifted, and we can experience that direct connection, that unmediated communion with the divine.
Wow. That's powerful. And speaking of powerful images, there's that line about there being no more night in the New Jerusalem. It's not just about literal darkness and light, is it?
No, absolutely not. It's about this reality where ignorance, doubt, fear, it's all gone. Where the shadows of the past, they don't haunt us anymore. It's about living in the full radiance of God's love, God's truth.
This overwhelming sense of peace and wholeness.
Yes, exactly. And, we see glimpses of that wholeness in the symbols that John uses throughout Revelation. Remember that tree of life we talked about earlier?
Right.
That image pops up again in this final vision.
Okay.
But this time, it's bearing fruit every month. And its leaves, they're for the healing of the nations.
Right. I remember that. It's this beautiful image of God's abundant provision, his healing touch. But what always resonated with me was that image of the river of the water of life, flowing right from God's throne. It's just such a powerful, evocative picture. What do you think John was trying to get across there?
I think it speaks to that constant flow of God's grace, his life-giving energy.
Yeah.
It's constantly nourishing and sustaining everything in this new creation. It's this picture of, yes, complete and utter dependence on God, but also this unimaginable abundance. There's no lack, no thirst that goes unquenched.
So everything's in perfect balance, harmony, no more striving, no more struggling, just this overwhelming sense of peace, fulfillment.
Yes.
Yes.
And it's interesting because even though John's describing this future reality, this new heaven and new earth, I think he wants us to have a taste of it now.
You mean we don't have to wait for some far-off future to experience God's peace and presence?
Exactly. Remember those choices we talked about?
Right.
Choosing to align ourselves with God's vision for the world.
Yeah.
It's in those choices, in those everyday acts of faith, love, and service that we actually participate in this new creation. We bring a little piece of that heaven to earth here and now.
So it's not just about escaping this world, but about transforming it.
Yes.
Being agents of healing, agents of hope in a world that so desperately needs it.
Absolutely. And I think that's a message that's just as powerful today as it was 2,000 years ago.
It really is. Well, I gotta say, diving into this book, it's intense, it's challenging, but ultimately, I'm walking away feeling hopeful.
Yeah.
It points us to this future that's just filled with God's love, grace, and this unimaginable beauty. So last question, if John were here today, walking down the streets, what do you think he'd point to as our Babylon? What modern day temptations, what distractions do you think he'd warn us about? Something to think about, right?
It is.
It's been quite a journey, this deep dive into the Joseph Smith translation of Revelation.
It really has.
Thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you next time.